Today, we look at the world in a way you rarely do, in extreme detail, on this episode of Behind the Shot. Hi, once again. Welcome to Behind the Shot. I'm your host, Steve Brazill. This is the podcast where we try and get inside the mind of great photographers by taking a closer look behind one of their shots, from conception to completion and all those little challenges and stories that happen in between. My guest today is a returning guest. I haven't had him on for about 6 months or so, but he's one of those photographers. You know what I mean? There's those photographers out in the world that when you see their work, you realize that you're doing everything in your life kind of wrong. This is Don Komarechka. Don, how are you, my friend?
I am great, Steve. Thank you so much for having me back on. Now that we're into the warmer weather, the subject matter that I call my own changes quite drastically from season to season.
Yeah, and this is a different season for you. Normally, you shoot very, very cold things. In fact, if they get warm, it kind of ruins the picture. And now you're more into the spring and summer season of what you shoot. So let's kind of tell people a little bit about you. First of all, you're a nature photographer. A macro photographer is mostly how I think of you, but also landscape and a bunch of other things, cityscapes, aurora. But here's some of the ones that really stick in my mind. Pollen. You shoot pollen. You shoot snowflakes. You shoot insects. You also have some really killer infrared stuff. Tell us, the people that don't know you, and I did have you on once before for a snowflake episode where we looked at one of your snowflake shots. And people, if you want to know what extreme macro photography is, go look up that episode. It'll be a link in the blog post as well at behindtheshot.tv. So Don, tell us a little bit about what you consider the type of photography that you do.
Call it the unseen world, Steve. Call it the world that you can't see with your own eyes, either because it's too small or that we're just incapable of seeing it. In terms of infrared photography or ultraviolet, there's patterns in flowers that insects can see that we can't. You can make pretty much anything fluoresce if you hit it with enough ultraviolet light, and then visible light bounces back. You dive into a flower and you see, just a world of detail, the universe at our feet. Is a wonderful thing to explore as a photographer, partly because you can take great images that way, but it has a certain impact on you as a human being, because a lot of these subjects, they're inconsequential to our survival and our daily lives, but there's an infinite beauty within them if you take the time to look for it.
Yeah, and you mentioned a couple things. One, we as larger humans, don't think about these small worlds that don't have an effect on our lives, but in many ways, we have an extreme effect on theirs. And it's a beauty that you don't see daily. Yes, you look at a flower and you think flowers are beauty by design. But then when you really get in and you look at that flower, or you look at the insect that's on that flower, I mentioned that you do infrared, but you mentioned UV light. You've got some really cool, we almost chose one for today, but we didn't. Really cool ultraviolet light photos as well. But let's talk a little bit about your background. You do workshops.
Yeah, in fact, I've got a bunch of them coming up this year all over North America, and I'm adding new dates to it all the time. But even here in my own backyard, where that photograph was taken, I do day-long macro photography workshops. I've got one coming up in July.
Where can people find the workshop info?
If you go to my website, doncom.ca, donkom.ca/workshops, you'll find all the details there.
Fantastic, fantastic. So along with that, I mentioned your snowflake photography. Canada made a coin with
2 of them, actually.
With your snowflakes, 2 of them. Okay. And then you told me something about your photos that I consider huge news. Share the news about what happened with some of your photos, including the image that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, I am just absolutely thrilled and honored that Panasonic has chosen to license about a dozen of my images taken with their cameras and lenses, and that's for worldwide perpetual use. I have no idea exactly where they're going to end up. I've got some ideas, but it makes me feel really good that a large camera manufacturer has kind of gotten on board with some of the work that I do is not normal. Like, it's not your everyday landscape and portraiture. It's often vibrant and colorful and sometimes otherworldly. And that's a lot of the stuff that they license. So that makes me very happy.
The otherworldly part really clicks with me too, by the way. That really does, which brings me into the last 2 things I want to mention before we get into the shot. And by the way, I told you, I think, privately in the green room, but this shot is just so freaking amazing. So you are credited as a macro photographer on Mosquito, which is a Discovery show. And then you also did some stuff.
I can say this now. There is a Discovery series coming out potentially later this month, or at least during the summer, called Don't Blink. And I believe it's going to be online availability so that people can stream it. And I am featured in 3 of the episodes of Don't Blink as on-camera talent, if you could call it that. In one episode, I'll be doing ultraviolet fluorescence. In another one is snowflakes, and another one freezing soap bubbles. So 3 episodes. I'm again really thrilled for this stuff. So
you are getting around so well. You also did stuff with National Geographic, the series One Strange Rock. So here's what I would suggest to anybody out there that's watching. If you haven't seen Don's work before, make sure that you go follow him online. And I'm dropping lower thirds up that have your websites and your social media things, but we'll mention them all a little bit later as well. And they will be in the blog post. Again, I've relaunched Behind the Shot. So the website now is behindtheshot.tv, and you can follow me on social media. I'll drop those up as well. Behind the Shot has a Facebook page, and then usually for Twitter and Instagram, it's just my own, which is Steve Brazill. But again, reach out to me. Give me the feedback. I really need it. Now, one other thing I want to mention is, especially with guests like Don, now that I'm doing this show on my own, I really need your help. If you guys could run by iTunes and drop an iTunes review, make sure you tell your friends, share the posts, get the word out that this show is out there, and let's see if we can get this thing up into the iTunes new featured group. You got to get a lot of subscriptions on iTunes and a lot of reviews for that. So Don, let's get into this shot a little bit. And before I bring the actual image up, explain to me what I don't want anybody to see it until they hear the description. Explain to me what type of image this is. What would you call this? It's a macro shot.
Yeah, it's diving right into a flower. And so inside this flower, as most flowers will have pollinators, we've got one actively scurrying around inside the flower. My lovely lady in green. It's a green sweat bee. And I love this composition because of color. Macro photography, you can play with saturated and vibrant colors. And oftentimes people say, well, how do you get such bright and beautiful colors? Well, you just choose bright and beautiful things. This flower is a pink Persian cornflower, I believe, and it's just so super saturated.
You mentioned something. I want to interrupt you on this for a second. You mentioned it. What kind of bee is it?
It is a sweat bee.
A sweat bee. Okay, so let me bring up this image because there's something else that you mentioned to me that kind of is I've got to know the answer to. First of all, it's a sweat bee, a green sweat bee, and you call it Lady in Green, and the title is Lady in Green. So I apologize if your ears aren't good for this. People, cover your ears now. How the heck do you know this is a lady?
It's all in the it's all in the legs, actually. So the back legs are different on a male versus a female, and the abdomen has different patterns. On a male, it's I think it's bright yellow and black, and on the female, it's black interspliced with waves of white fur. So the female is hairier than the male on the backside. So it's not it's not anything untoward. It's just the patterns on the back legs and on the abdomen of the bee that give away the gender. Now, I don't know any of this before I take the picture. This is all learned as I'm thinking. Okay, well, what the heck is this? I want to know as much about this as possible. I didn't even know the name of the flower when I was taking the picture. This all came in research after the fact.
Okay, see, and here's what's interesting, because again, kind of like when we introduced it, right? This is one of those types of shots that I love on many different levels, from both an artistic point of view and a technical photography point of view. And actually, before I say that, we should probably get the EXIF data out there, because there's always somebody that will email me or message me going, you discussed this whole shot and I don't know what settings you used. So your EXIF data on this, if I looked it up right, if it's correct in the picture, and
it should be.
Do you know what it is?
I can look it up as well. I don't know if you have it handy. But
I have it handy. Tell me if this sounds right. I just looked it up hoping the EXIF data is right. I have it at ISO 200, 2.8,
Yep.
1/60th of a second. Does that sound about right?
1/160th of a second.
I'm sorry, 1/160th of a second. Yeah.
Yes, that sounds correct.
Okay, and it's a Panasonic body, a GX9.
That's right.
But it's a Leica lens.
Right. Panasonic has a partnership with Leica to make a lot of their higher end lenses, or at least to design them. And I'm absolutely loving this 45 millimeter Leica f2.8 lens. And, for macro photography, one of the things that a lot of macro photographers will always be seeking is more magnification. You can never have enough magnification. You want to get closer and closer. And on the Canon side, I've got a lot of very specialized and expensive gear to get me there. But if I have this lens at its closest magnification, that's 1:1, due to the smaller sensor size, it's like a magnification increase. If I compare that to a 1:1 image on my regular full frame digital SLR, it's only halfway there. It's half the magnification. So you can get right in. And I did crop this image a little bit just for composition, but I could have even gotten closer if I wanted to.
So I mentioned that this image kind of struck me in multiple ways. And one of them is purely from a fine art point of view. The lady in green against this background, the color contrast in this image is brilliant, right? Not only that, but I'm trying to remember. I think it was Rick Salmon once was talking about photographing horses at a workshop or seminar thing that I saw. And he mentioned that when you shoot horses, one of the keys is that you don't want the legs in alignment with each other. You want some of the legs, bent up in movement. And if you look here, you could not have asked this bee to position his antennae more perfectly, his legs more perfectly. The stamen sticking up land in you could have been unlucky. There could have been a stamen right in front of that beautiful eye.
Oh, and there was many of those, Steve, because I have to reiterate one very important element about macro photography. Chaos is an element in every image. And so in this sense, I spent maybe a good hour or two photographing these bees, ending up with 100 or so photographs. Some were great. Some were, out of focus, or they just didn't, they weren't up to snuff. But it's maybe a 100-to-1 ratio. Take 100 photos to get that one special shot.
Okay.
That you really have.
Now that right there is a huge bit of information for beginning photographers. Like being a concert photographer, I have people say all the time, or people ask in Facebook forums, how many shots are you guys taking per band? I feel like I'm taking 300 shots and getting 6. And people need to understand, depending on the subject matter that you're shooting, that type of thing is not unusual to take, to have your hit ratio be very low based on magnification, position, light, your control over any of those. So when you shoot a shot like this, you're serious 100-to-1. If you took 100 shots, you might only be happy with a very small number.
That's right. And for every, angle that seems appropriate, like the bee is kind of coming towards you like it was in this particular photograph, you have to, take rapid fire bursts because, again, those antennae and those legs, they move really, really quickly. And you have to possibly be shifting your focus through that as well. Now, I should make a slight correction to the EXIF data. I did bring it up. It was the lens is an f2.8 lens, but it was shot at f13.
Okay.
And the reason why this is important is because even at f13, I have such a razor thin depth of field. So this bee is maybe a half an inch long or so. And I can't even get, like, if its face is in focus, by the time the focus falls to the backside, to the abdomen and the tips of the wings, it's blurry at that point. So if the eyes are out of focus, you've lost the shot. And I have a lot of images just like this one that have the eyes slightly out of focus because those compound eyes will lose their texture instantly as soon as focus is lost. Now, there's no overcoming this. I'm at f13. I can shoot at f16, f22. I'm not going to drastically improve my depth of field. That's never going to happen in a shot like this. Now, for some static images where the subject is non-dynamic, you can combine multiple images together for focus stacking. We talked about that with my snowflake image.
Right.
And that's great, but it's not possible for an image like this.
Well, see, and you answered one of the questions, which was going to be, first of all, in a macro, your depth of field is razor thin. And in my head, it's because what the EXIF said, it's at 2.8. How did you do this? So now we know. But I am still confused by something. This is a 45 millimeter fixed focal length macro lens. So
That's
how
correct.
closer you are to this girl?
So I'm probably around 3 or 4 inches away from the tip of the lens to where the subject is. It's a lot of these bees don't care about you. I mean, you're not
Well, and that's what I
actively
was going to ask was I don't understand why she's sitting there while you're, coming in with this giant reflective surface to her. I mean, to her eyes, it's a giant reflection of herself.
They are so enamored with that flower. Unless I'm rapidly approaching and like waving my hand over the flower, I might be a predator or something, they're just going to sit pretty and mind their own business. And I'm actually surprised that they're not distracted by the flash used in images like this, because this image was taken with a ring flash mounted to the front of the lens, something that a lot of photographers are on the fence about. Some people say, a ring flash is it's really flat. It doesn't give you a nice dynamic feel. But if you look closely at this image, Steve, you'll notice there are no shadows, right? A ring flash is notorious for having sort of a shadowless effect when it's mounted right on the camera. Now you can hold it off to the side.
So the lens is going through the middle of the ring.
The lens is going through the middle of the ring. And in this case, it was balanced so that both sides of the ring, you can make one side brighter than the other if you want, but they were both the same brightness. And that created a very even and very soft lighting effect. And that, in some cases, will ruin a shot because you lose so much depth. Shadows.
Right. Light illuminates, shadows define. That's how you get depth and 3D effect in an image. But
I'm still getting that here. And I'm getting that here because of the color. And the color will supersede that shadow effect as defining the image.
Right. And this bee has, first of all, the fine detail, like you say, the color in the bee's body. There's one thing that keeps coming back to me on this shot. I could swear she's looking at you. Now, there's no way to know, right? But there's no way she doesn't see you, not with that eye. Do you, and this is outside, right?
Yeah, I'm sure this bee is aware of my presence.
Okay. So it's handheld, or are you using a macro slider?
No, this is handheld, and this is an important feature of how you can get a shot like this. Because if I was on a rail, number one, this flower is moving slightly, and there's a cluster of flowers. The bees are going from flower to flower. I would have to wait a very long time before I would get anything useful if the camera was locked down on a tripod. So by free holding the camera and kind of chasing after these bees, it gives you more opportunity to take a shot. Now, that's not to say that you're going to get the shot that you're after, because you're still going to be at like that 100-to-1 ratio of shots to keepers. But you'll be actively trying to pursue this bee, moving around and following it through the scene.
Okay, hold on. I'm trying to picture this in my head, because we all know you can mount on a tripod, or they have rails, sliders, macro sliders, which enable you to slide your camera forward and backward while it's on a tripod, which would be great for a static object. But what you're saying in this particular case is it's not just that you're moving because, think about it. I mean, you're close to something. You've got that issue of just normal movement. You're not at a super high shutter speed at 1/160th. So, but you're consciously aware that you're kind of moving with the element you're shooting. Is that what you're saying?
So you touched on two things there, and I'm going to get back to the 1/160th of a second in a minute. But first, in order to focus and to find the subject within the frame, I'm not relying on autofocus at all. In fact, I'm not even relying on manual focus. I'll set the focus point to be what I want my magnification to be. So roughly what I want to be in the frame in terms of size and scale. That will set my focus, my focal plane, at a specific point from the front lens. And that's always going to be the exact same distance. It's called a working distance. You use that term in microscopes more than with cameras, but it's the same thing. And so in order to find the focus, I physically move the camera forward and backward to change where the subject is going to fall through that focal plane. And it ends up being really freeing and really versatile, because in this scenario, autofocus, no matter how good it is, even on my 1DX Mark II, it will fail. It
cannot track this.
It can't track it as accurately as you'd like. These focus algorithms are not trained to find insect eyes.
And you couldn't do it with your hand on the focus ring. You pretty much have to pre-focus and then go with it.
Right. Pre-focus and go with it, because that bee is constantly moving and you can move counter to it forward and backward much easier than moving a ring on the camera. Moving the ring on the lens is also going to shake the camera a little bit, and you want that thing to be as solid as possible.
Oh, good point.
So now that will help you get focus where you want it to be. And a lot of photographers will then say, at shutter speeds like this, motion blur is going to be a huge issue. And it would be. If I was using ambient light, exclusively ambient light for an image like this, I would have to have a much higher ISO and probably a looser, wider aperture in order to get a shutter speed that is effective. 1/160th of a second is the flash sync speed for this camera. So I like to give this scenario. If I have a...
You mean the maximum flash sync speed?
Right.
Okay.
So in this fictional scenario, if I had a completely dark room, not a photon of stray light in that room, and I set my camera up for a 10-minute exposure, and arbitrarily through that time period, I pop a flash, what is the duration of my exposure? Is it 10 minutes or is it the duration of the flash? Well, technically it's both, but the one that matters is the flash duration. And with xenon flash tubes at their lowest power settings, and in macro photography, they're usually at a fairly low power because they're right on top of the subject, the duration of a flash could be 1/20,000th of a second in favorable conditions. And so if you can factor that into the equation, if in this exact shot I was at ISO 200 and f13 at 1/160th of a second with no flash, the image is black. It's that fictitious black room scenario. That exposure doesn't matter. The one that matters is the duration of the flash that's applied to it, which at low power settings would be incredibly fast, and no motion blur will ever come in. That's one of the secrets of macro photography, is using flash to overcome motion blur, which is a huge frustration for beginners.
See, and that to me right there, what you just went through is the reason you can go out and just try and do macro photography on your own, obviously. And you can learn and you can research a ton of things. But this is actually, to me, the perfect example of why somebody would choose to go to a workshop like yours or something. Because it's that kind of in-depth detail of real-world working experience. See, the problem with some self-learning, I'm not saying it's bad. I mean, I've done a ton of self-learning. I got my computer engineer, Microsoft certified systems engineer originally by self-studying. But the problem with self-learning is you only tend to self-learn what you know you need to go find. And it's these real world tips, like what you just said about really understanding what flash is doing in a macro environment that will help, which takes us to the next important thing here. An average person, beginner, newbie, that picks up a Canon or a Nikon with one of their default 50 or 100 or 105 macro lenses. What could they do? What's your one tip that would have them succeed more from the start?
Okay, so keeping in mind that a lot of advice has possibly a small budgetary attachment to it. So number one, if you are a Canon shooter, right away I'd recommend getting the Yongnuo ring flash. It's the YN-14EX. And this is a beautiful clone, like almost a complete perfect knockoff of the Canon MR-14EX flash that costs around $500. The Yongnuo one is $95. I've owned and used them both, and I can tell you that the Yongnuo is a phenomenal piece of equipment. You can see very similar stuff used in this image. It's used for all of my snowflake work. It's my general go-to solution unless for some reason a ring flash is unsuited for the subject. The shells of a ladybug, the eyes of a spider, water droplets, anything that's spherical will give you a ring flash reflection on it that's kind of distracting.
Right.
For almost everything else, it can be very useful, both on the camera and held off. And for $95 in the grand scheme of things, photographically, that's not expensive.
And if it breaks, you can buy 5 of those for the cost of a Canon.
Well, exactly. Now, I was actually using the Canon one. I happen to already own that one, but I put it on the Panasonic camera, and so even the Yongnuo flash I could put on the Panasonic camera. You could put it on a Nikon or Pentax or Sony camera without any issue. You would just have to use it like I did in this image in a manual exposure. So you set the flash to a manual flash power, take a test shot. Oh, wow, that's too bright or too dark. Just adjust. I mean, unless your lighting conditions change, then you should get a consistent exposure time and time again for the entire session that you're shooting for. So a ring flash or some kind of instantaneous light, whether it be you've got an off-camera flash, well, buy a wireless trigger for it, and maybe a little stand so that you could put it next to a subject like this. Anything that you can do to get instantaneous light is going to be an advantage for you, because the biggest challenge for me when I was first getting into macro photography, couldn't get enough depth of field. And when I tried to get a greater depth of field by making my aperture smaller, I didn't have enough light and everything was becoming blurry. So in order to fight one challenge, I was encountering others, and it was just layers of frustration on top of frustration. All of that was solved when I bought a ring flash.
Or a good way to word it is when you bought the right tools. So
exactly.
On a shot like this, helicopter view, I mean, obviously we can't do a Photoshop lesson or anything, but what's your base post-processing on a shot like this?
This surprisingly very, very little. I believe I edited this one in on One Photo Raw, which is one of my new favorite RAW processors for a number of reasons. But
Renee Robin uses that, and my buddy Troy Miller is a huge fan too, yeah.
Yeah, this was actually done with a pre-release version that I bugged them for. For the month of June, I am their guest coach. And so I shooting this with the Panasonic GX9 wasn't supported with their previous version, so I bugged them for an early pre-release version, and really just cropping it in, maybe rotating it a little bit just to get some nice dynamic lines. If you see the top left corner, you've got a little bit of a triangle and diagonal lines drawing your eye into the frame. Having those kinds of framing elements are useful.
That's true. That's another thing. This has leading lines.
It does, and they're kind of hidden in the background. You don't notice them.
They're
right
subliminal,
away,
but they're there. They are definitely there.
Macro photography is all about lines and shapes and color. And so oftentimes I'm cropping in post-process for lines that I couldn't really plan for in the field because there's just too much chaos going on. So I'm just trying to redefine the image based on those terms and really making the eye stand out. So using a bit of structural adjustment on the eye just to make it pop. I don't think that there was much else done with this. Those colors are natural to the image. And, part of the fun of this is, understanding what colors you might be able to get and how you can, if you want to photograph beautiful flowers, go to the garden store in the fall, buy a bunch of bulbs, put them in the ground. And in the springtime, you're playing the long game, but you're going to have the color palette for you to experiment with. And hopefully you get some lovely pollinators to come alongside. By the way, you can actually buy pollinators. A lot of, there's some natural pest control companies out there will sell you pollinating bees. So I bought mason bees and leafcutter bees. I haven't seen them in the garden this year, but I bought a bunch of them and I'm hoping I can track some down. So you can actually get all of the ingredients and kind of manufacture
to set up the scenario to happen for you, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. And I'm lucky enough that these green sweat bees come back year on year and they reliably go to these beautiful pink flowers and then to all of the thistles that we have growing in our yard. They love those too. So, and that's not to say this is all there is. I've got some beautiful orchids that are just about to bloom in the garden. And I'm going to make a photograph with them, but I have no idea what visual ingredients are going to come into play. It might take an afternoon of just humming and hawing and watching things come and go to these flowers to see what that story and that narrative is going to be. But I'm sure you'll agree, Steve, that this image has a narrative. It's one foreign to us as humans, but it is the insect world, and you're living it, and it's kind of a living, breathing space that I hope this image embodies.
Yeah, and you look, again, I love this image on both the technical end, but also the art end, because it's not one of those insect images that makes you, would make somebody go, oh, creepy crawly thing. It's a beautifully executed creature, basically, is what it is. And I love that. So, if you haven't seen Don Komarechka's work, check out his websites. I'll throw those up in just a second. And of course, at behindtheshot.tv, I will have a small gallery on the blog post associated with this episode of his work as well. But you got to check out his stuff. So, Don, how can people find you? First of all, you've got 2 websites. What are those?
So that's doncom.ca. That's where my main portfolio of work is. My snowflake work is quite prominent, and it's a big part of my business. So I've got a separate website for that where I sell a book called Sky Crystals, and the website for that is skycrystals.ca. But Steve, let's not forget about Photo Geek Weekly.
Photo Geek Weekly, the podcast, which I've been on luckily twice. You know what? Give me the the quick helicopter view so people understand Photo Geek Weekly and they can subscribe at your website?
Of course. So Photo Geek Weekly is a weekly play on the geekiest, most technical photography news that I can drum up. If the news is slow, we'll go into controversial topics on photographic morality or ethics or legal stuff. But it's all the behind the scenes, not all of the front running topics that you would get from the majority of photography podcasts out there. We try to take a different approach, really get under the hood with things. And Steve, you're a great guest to have on that podcast. We got to have you back.
We talked about the fastest camera on Earth, and I'm not going to tell you what it is. Just what's the website?
Photogeekweekly.com.
Photogeekweekly.com. Make sure you subscribe to that one. Give him some reviews as well. But go look up the episode where we talked about, first of all, a camera that can take pictures of sound, and then also the fastest camera. I'm not going to share what it is. You got to go look it up, but trust me, well worth it. Where else? What are you on Twitter, by the way?
So I'm Donkom, DONKOM on Twitter, and you'll find me on Facebook at Donkom Photo, and I'm there on Instagram as well as Donkom Photo.
Okay, so Donkom Photo on both Facebook and Instagram.
Yeah.
Okay, and then where can people find your workshops?
So doncom.ca/workshops is where I'll have all of the ones listed for my in-studio stuff. And I've got to put more of those listings up for the stuff that I'll be doing. Just briefly, I'm at the NECCC conference in Amherst, Massachusetts, and that's coming up in July. I will be at the Mike Moats Macro Photography Conference in October. And in Princeton, New Jersey, I've got an infrared photography workshop alongside macro photography workshops, and those are going to be in September. So that's going to be I think there's a few spots left in that one, but they're going quickly.
And again, I can't stress it enough. Think about the name of his podcast, right? Photo Geek Weekly. If you are looking to really learn photography, and if you're like me, it's not just, it's kind of like the old saying, anybody can mow their yard, but it's the person who edges the yard, right? If you want the details that really will take your macro photography, or for that matter, your infrared or ultraviolet or landscape photography to the next level. It's the details that are going to get you there, and Don's the guy that knows them. So Don Komarechka, thank you so much for coming on my podcast again. I cannot wait to have you on again because I do want to do one of your ultraviolet shots really badly.
Oh, well, and then that's a really fun rabbit hole to go down. There's a lot of technical stuff to decide beyond just macro photography. So we'll save that for another episode. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, again, thank you very much. And to everybody, thanks so much for following Behind the Shot. Make sure that you subscribe to the podcast. You can find the links at the website behindtheshot.tv. You can subscribe through iTunes or whatever podcast app that you like. But again, as I've just relaunched on my own, I could really use your help. Head to the website, head to iTunes, leave a review, pass it on to your friends, help me spread the word. I'd really, really appreciate it. Again, my name is Steve Brazill, the host. Thanks for joining us, taking a look behind the shot.